want to talk about the murder of my sister-in-law, Joan Webster. She became a missing person on November 28, 1981 in Boston from Logan Airport. In February of this year, 2008, a book was written. This is the book. You'll see that mine has just numerous flags in it. I was the only person married into the immediate family, the Webster family, during this tragedy. And went through many, many years. This is a highly publicized case and one that has a great deal of question still remaining. It is an unresolved case. The book that was put out was written by Tim Burke. He was the former assistant district attorney who became involved in the case, and he has put forward a theory that a Leonard Paradiso murdered my sister-in-law. Mr. Paradiso was never charged, was never indicted, and frankly there was absolutely nothing, as I go back now and look at actual records, actual transcripts, grand jury testimony, courtroom testimony, affidavits, police records. There's absolutely nothing that connects this man with my sister-in-law, Joan Webster. Mr. Paradiso was convicted of the murder of Maria Iannuzzi from August of 1979. He was indeed a parolee at the time and had been to a wedding with Maria Iannuzzi, but he was not the prime suspect. The boyfriend, David Doyle, was the prime suspect, and the district attorney at that time had a very solid case to bring against Mr. Doyle, but that never happened. Instead, 2 years later, when my sister-in-law, Joan, became a missing person, there was a great deal of media frenzy. There was a great deal spotlighted and a determination to find someone to scapegoat, someone to blame for the murder of my sister-in-law. Mr. Paradiso was convicted of that crime, and in reviewing the crime of Maria Iannuzzi, and in reviewing that, there is strong evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, of a cover-up, people not wanting actual things to be learned. Mr. Burke based both cases, as well as a federal case that came later, on the affidavit or testimony of a Robert Bond, a convicted murderer. There's a great deal now that shows that perhaps Mr. Burke did not have the letter that he claims he had in this book. The information that Mr. Bond provided to authorities certainly was information that could have been provided by the authorities. The boat theory about Joan being dumped overboard off a boat out in the ocean was found to be false when her remains were found buried in 1990 in Hamilton, Massachusetts, and yet anyone close to the case, who had previously been close to the case, maintained that Mr. Bond, a two-time murderer, was credible. There are 3 documents that I have been able to see that do establish that the boat theory was brought up well before Mr. Bond was brought into the situation. It also indicates that the Websters had Mr. Paradiso's name less than 2 months into the case in January of 1982. That was a full year before Mr. Bond's statement was brought to light and even began to be heavily publicized in the press, brought forward, leaked by a trooper, Andrew Palumbo, and a trooper, Carmen Tamero, who had both been involved in Joan's case right from the very beginning. There are concerns that Mr. Bond was influenced by favors, and that also appears in documents. But for me, the biggest concern is how my in-laws, both trained in the CIA, people who were trained to dig for information and whatnot, could be duped by such a thing. They definitely wanted for victims to come forward. There were alleged abuse victims that came forward in the trial against Mr. Paradiso in the Iannuzzi case. Many of these were conflicting with the actual police reports at the time, So the testimony, which was worked by Mr. Troopers Palumbo and Tamaro, they came forward with uncorroborated and unverified accounts accusing Mr. Paradiso of things that were probably not true. I am extremely concerned that this family continues to influence that this man did it. I have seen the actual documents, and there are countless news reports of the Websters wanting the truth to come out about their daughter, wanting abuse victims to come forward. They did deny their own granddaughters, and they did deny their daughter-in-law the right to speak out and to deal with issues that have been alleged in letters that my child wrote. So I'm very concerned about the duplicity of what's taken place. The records of Joan Webster are still inaccessible. It is an open murder case. There is evidence now that Mr. Paradiso was not guilty of the crime, and it's important for the Websters perhaps to address some of those issues because questions are being raised as to whether their background, their associations and involvements with the CIA could have been directly or indirectly responsible for the death of Joan. And certainly it sickens me that anyone or anything would be more important than their own daughter. But I will not leave my daughters at risk, either whether a family is too gullible or ignorant to have bought into a complete fabrication, or that for some reason they know that it's not the truth, but it's an explanation that could be offered to the public to satisfy the case. This is not what happened in the case, and I know certain elements in this book that are completely false. I know representations of the family that are not true. And having had the insight of being a part of the family, I heard things that now I begin to question because they're not showing up, and have to wonder whether I was told truthful things about the disappearance of my sister-in-law, Joan Webster. A lot of people would be concerned, feeling that the Websters are victims. They lost a child. Well, you know, I've had 2 children ripped out of my life, and a lot of questions unanswered, a lot of secrecy. And where some people may feel they don't have the right to ask the Websters or challenge the Websters on why it is they are convinced that this man was responsible for the murder of Joan, I do have the right, and I do have the responsibility. We're talking about the well-being of my children, and whatever has influenced the Websters to believe that this is the true story is false. You know, whether they were led down a primrose path, I just find that really hard to believe. These are educated people. They were involved. They had the resources. It makes no sense. It is an illogical conclusion to think that they could have been duped. So that leaves the other concern as to why would they go along with something that was contrived and, you know, wrongfully incarcerate a man, pile on this man. That was their own, that's been a publicly documented position of theirs, was to basically pile on, find as much as they could to, you know, condemn this man. Mr. Paradiso was not responsible for the murder of my sister-in-law, Joan.